Hello there and welcome to Our Voices. Ethiopia is clouded by ethnic tensions ignited by political marginalization and a fight for resources and land among dozens of ethnic groups in the country. The UN says violence in Ethiopia has displaced about 2.4 million people. Two separate attacks in Ethiopia have left 5 senior Ethiopian officials dead, including the Army Chief of Staff and the Attorney General of the Amhara region. International news media reports both attacks took place on June 22nd, and they were led by General Ashenafi, who has been accused of building an ethnic militia in Amhara. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is urging his country to unite. He spoke to VOA's Amharic service in late May and had this to say about Ethiopia's ethnic divide.
My agenda is not to use certain groups to attack certain groups or to push specific groups or oppress people. What I am working on is work that elevates Ethiopians. That's what I want, and that is what I do, and what I want to make to push that there is awareness of this. This is why we are working tirelessly without taking breaks, and we have been successful in the past year. This is a result of giving ourselves entirely. I can confidently say that I will not be involved in killing people or benefiting by illegal means by taking away from other people's pocket as long as I am in a position of leadership.
Prime Minister Abiy has made rigorous reforms, including appointing women in high government offices. I spoke to one of those women, Meaza Ashenefi, the first female Chief Justice in Ethiopia. Her thoughts on justice later in the program. But first, is Ethiopia experiencing growing pains, or is this the norm? And what role do courts across the continent have in delivering justice to citizens? Welcome to the conversation. I'm Ayan Bior, here along with my co-host, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick, Ariane Itangishaka, and sitting in for Hadiza Kyari is VOA multimedia journalist Salim Solomon. Thanks for joining us again, Salim.
Thanks for having me.
So at the beginning of the year, the entire world watched Ethiopia with a sense of intrigue and fascination. You follow Ethiopia closely and you report on it regularly. Give us some context about what's going on.
You know, Ethiopia's had an unprecedented change in the past year, more than a year. Now, there's a lot of, reforms since Abiy Ahmed has been the prime minister of the country, but it shows that how volatile things are. Even when he was appointed, there was a grenade attack during a big rally that celebrated his appointment. And so the recent events of the killing of this military chief is added to the complex nature of the country and also how, uncertain things are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when we look at the continent, I see a lot of areas where tensions, especially ethnic tensions, are fuming in so many different places. And the world is not really paying attention into some of these places until big protests or civil war breaks out and hundreds of people are dying. Places like in Cameroon, where the English-speaking marginalized areas, people are fighting against the French. You see also in Nigeria, where the northern parts, people are marginalized. The underdeveloped areas, people become radicals. We also see it in Ethiopia 2-3 years ago when the marginalized communities, there was reports that in protests about 300 to 400 people died. And so you ask yourself, can these groups of people really trust in the political, economic, or even judicial systems that's supposed to protect them? So I think that sometimes the social equilibrium is what we overlook that ends up being a problem when people really, that are marginalized take actions in the streets.
Yeah, marginalization is at the heart of this. You see that women were also marginalized from being part of the decision-making process. And one of the positive changes Abiy Ahmed has made in the beginning of the year is that he included a lot of women in his cabinet member. And one of the biggest positive things that he's done is he appointed Meaza Ashenefi as Ethiopia's Supreme Court president to repair the image of the judicial system. Meaza is the first woman to lead the country's Supreme Court, and she has built a career on advocating for women. Here's a profile of her.
For the first time in its modern history, Ethiopia's Supreme Court is being led by a woman. Meaza Ashenefi, a lawyer and a women's rights advocate, accepted the offer last November. Meaza has been a crusader against harmful practices that victimize women. One of her most famous cases involved a 14-year-old girl who was kidnapped by a man trying to force her into child marriage, a traditional practice in some parts of Ethiopia. The girl shot and killed her abductor, but was cleared of charges due to Meaza's work. The incident was dramatized in an award-winning film, Different. In her extensive career as a lawyer, judge, legal advocate, and business leader, Meaza has focused on women's rights and economic empowerment.
For example, in Ethiopia, there is no law, independent law on violence against women. We just have few provisions in the criminal code. So going forward, I think we need to have a comprehensive law that addresses issues of violence against women and law.
Meaza also founded the Ethiopian Women's Lawyers Association, a group focusing on issues of sexual and intimate partner violence. She hopes to restore respect for the legal system in the eyes of all Ethiopians who sometimes view the court as biased or slow to respond. Meaza wants Ethiopians to view the court as able to hold all to account, including those in power. She believes she has an ally in Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, Ethiopia's young, reform-minded leader. Abiy highlighted the role the court could play in strengthening Ethiopia's civil society and spoke of his experience.
Everyone should get equal treatment in the face of the law. It should never be used as a tool for revenge. When we respect the rule of law, it should be in accordance to that.
Meaza hopes her understanding of Ethiopia's culture and people will be an asset in her position as she seeks solutions to seemingly intractable problems.
If under my leadership we manage to cement the independence of the judiciary in Ethiopia, this is not going to change the history of the last 40 years. This is going to change the history of the last 3,000 years of judicial administration in Ethiopia.
You know, Meaza has had such an impressive career, and I had a chance to sit down with her for a one-on-one interview. And, you know, the one thing that really caught my attention is, you know, everyone is making such a big deal about her appointment because she is the first president of the Supreme Court in Ethiopia. But she doesn't see herself as that. She sees herself as a Supreme Court justice that just happens to be a woman. And, you know, obviously she knows that she has a place in history and that little girls are looking up to her as a role model. But, you know, the other thing that caught my attention is she told me that she told the Prime Minister's office that if he wants business as usual, she's not the right person for the job because she intends to go in there and make reforms as well.
And, you know, I was thinking, I did not know much about her before her appointment. And I think, you know, there might be many people around the continent who also do not know her. But I think she's one of those women, you might not know her, but you should know her. And I'm so glad we have the opportunity to introduce this woman to our audience. But something else that struck me really about her appointment in general, that when a country enters a new dispensation and when you have new leadership, there's a real opportunity here for women and to really achieve gender parity and do right by women. You know, in South Africa in the 90s, women were part of writing and drafting the Constitution. That first phase of drafting a Constitution is the most important phase because later on you can't go back and change many things. And that's where you can really bring women into the conversation, have women help craft the laws. The Constitution is the highest law in the land, and I'm so glad she is in this particular position where she can have influence, because if we want to advocate for women through the law, we need women doing it. And I'm just so happy that Ethiopia has taken hold of this opportunity. Not every country has that opportunity.
You know, the thing about Meaza, she deliberated for like 7 days or more before she actually took the position. She was, you know, thinking about how big of a role this is. And so, I mean, think about when countries don't have strong institutions. One of her monumental case that was featured in a movie that we saw is about, you know, a young rape victim that the court system in Ethiopia wasn't really supporting. In fact, they have to go somewhere. They have to look for justice and appeal somewhere else. Right. And one of the specific examples in 2016 was an African Human Rights Court looked at this case, specific case, of a 13-year-old girl that was abducted and raped. And they looked at the case and they overturned an appeal. And so where do countries that don't have strong institutions, where do they go? Where do they go? You know, you have special courts like after long years of genocide in Rwanda, the Gacaca court. You have cases of long years of civil war in Sierra Leone when you have special courts specifically addressing like countries that come out of a very, very traumatic experience.
Yeah, but the sad part is that even the international courts that these other countries can go to sometimes are not even trusted. I mean, you know, the ICC, a lot of countries in Africa are losing hope in ICC, with Burundi quitting, as you know.
Right.
South Africa took a big step, almost quitting. Kenya, Uganda, Chad, Namibia.
Omar al-Bashir in Sudan has avoided the ICC for years now.
Countries
With South
really
Africa's
lost
help.
faith in the International Criminal Court, which is really sad. But, you know, this fact that 80% of the cases that are tried there are Africans somewhat justify the reason why they're trying to leave, but it's sad when they these countries loses faith in the International Criminal Court.
But it also goes down to a very grassroots level. When people don't have access to justice, or they know they cannot count on actually receiving justice, they will take things into their own hands. We see mob justice. In South Africa, we have what's known in the townships as kangaroo courts, where people know if a man has raped a child, he will face justice in the townships, because they know that the police won't necessarily come and arrest that person or find them.
Yeah. So it's actually very interesting that you're talking about this, because you need fresh blood like this, people who are actually sticking up for the victims, and also, you know, giving justice for all, be it the powerful or the weak.
And women will start feeling confident enough to come forward and now speak, because they know there is someone fighting for them.
Absolutely. Well, these are really great points, ladies. And so you've had a chance to hear some of our thoughts, but we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts on WhatsApp. That number is on your screen, or find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our handle is @VOA Our Voices. Coming up, what does justice look like for women in Ethiopia? I asked Meaza Ashenefi that very question. Her response after the break. Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about.
Sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives.
Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices.
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And Hadiza Kiari.
And Ayan Bior.
And Orion Itangi Shaka.
Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices. Welcome back. You're with Our Voices. Wesibawi Tenkosa, that is a term in Amharic for sexual harassment. But the term didn't exist until Meaza Ashenefi, who we profiled in the first half of the program, came up with it. As a young lawyer, Meaza soon realized that the lack of a specific term for sexual harassment complicated litigating cases. In our one-on-one interview with the Chief Justice, I asked her why it was important for her to come up with the term. I want to talk about sexual harassment, because when you became a lawyer, you fought very hard against gender discrimination and women's rights. And I'm aware that there wasn't a term for sexual harassment in Amharic. Why was it important for you to come up with a term and to name it?
Yeah. There was no term for not only sexual harassment, but there was no terminology also for violence against women until we call it tqat. And naming it was very important. Unless you name it, it's difficult to advocate for legislative reform, to articulate the issue, and to publicize and expose the practice. So naming was very important, because then we were able to include it in the law as a criminal behavior, and educate women about their rights.
What do you think the role of the courts is to make sure that victims, do get redress?
Yeah. The court is supposed to be impartial, and judges are supposed to be impartial. They are supposed to use the law, irrespective of who the party in the litigation is. But I'm a believer in that judges have to be pragmatic also, because interpreting the law, the letter of the law, is one thing, but also they have to take into account, the dynamics in the communities. They have to understand the challenges, and at the end of the day, I think they have to have their eyes on justice.
What does justice look like for women in Ethiopia?
I want them to be treated fairly. I want them to have the confidence that nobody is above the law. I want them to believe that our judiciary is for the poor as much as it is for the rich. So I I want them to believe that we will have an independent and an impartial institution.
Other than being a woman, what makes you different from other Chief Justices that Ethiopia has seen?
Well, probably I'm too assertive. Yeah, and no, everybody has played their part, honestly, and most of them have been in the judiciary for a long time, and probably they focused on case management, but I am focusing on reform, and I have a long-term view for the judiciary.
It's actually really interesting seeing Meaza talk about having terms so that in the court of law, in the letter of the law, when you're taking these cases, it's easier to litigate these things. For me, when I first, it takes me back to the time when I first started working at VOA. I broadcast, stories that are about sexual harassment. And the first time I actually learned about wasibawi guntela or tunkosa, or tsotawi, they say tsotawi guntela or tunkosa, which means gender-based violence, is when I learned about the term itself. And so it's very interesting to see how these terms don't even exist in some of these cultures, because it's just, one, it's a taboo, and there are so many barriers to have a genuine conversation about.
It's too weird to talk about.
Genuine conversation about these issues.
And even when the term exists, which in my culture it did, but you don't come face to face with it until you are maybe in the workplace. Like in your case, I'm sure you are not the only one, because we didn't learn about this at school. We certainly didn't learn about it as young children. I think, all these unwanted touching that I just could never say no matter how uncomfortable you felt, because the person was some sort of elder perhaps in church, or it was a family member. This idea that, men could kiss you as a child on the mouth, and later on you start thinking, but this is gross. A man can touch you and you cannot say anything because you should not be disrespectful. And I think that is something in our culture we really need to address. I'm glad to see even in my family some women are starting to address and say no.
Right.
There's no reason for an older man to be kissing a child. But then I think also we need to teach boys and girls in school about what sexual harassment is, age-appropriate lessons about it.
And the part that you said, Haiti, about not hearing about it until the workplace is because the patriotic society that are so conservative sometimes, or just wanting to sweep these bad behaviors under the rug, can actually allow it. I mean, you have a place like in Burundi where we do have a word somewhat, but it doesn't really coin exactly that behavior. I spoke to one of the linguist expert in Burundi, and I wanted to know exactly what the precise word would be, and he said it's gukora ubutimirwa. And that's, to an average Kirundi speaker, it's not really a precise word. It's somewhat
like
obscure. It's a sentence that's very obscure, and not only it's obscure, but it means to behave flirtatiously but sadly with impunity, as though it's allowed. Wow. Because it's a man who's doing it. They're trying to almost justifying the act. So try to take that to court, saying, somebody did that to you, and it's a society where...
When you live in a culture where there's a culture of impunity when it comes to rape, imagine with sexual harassment.
Sexual harassment is a small thing.
I mean, there is a culture of victim blaming, and I'm not surprised that there wasn't a word in Amharic, because there's also a culture of silence around sexual harassment and these issues that we face. And I'm reminded of what happened not too long ago in Abuja, where a group of women in a nightclub were targeted by police officers. They were beat, they were detained, some were even raped. The officers accused them of being prostitutes. They weren't doing anything wrong, they were just in the club, and sure, they were dressed provocatively, but that does not mean that they were doing anything wrong. And so I think that, trying to shift, trying to talk about it more so that the people who are supposed to protect us, the police officers, respect women instead of treating them as criminals just because, they're walking down the street with a short shirt. Or
here's the thing, it's like the common explanation or justification for a criminal act, basically, if you think about it in the court of law. I mean, according to a survey in Egyptian Center for Women, actually the UN Women also, 99.3% of women said that they've experienced sexual harassment. This is the country, so you could be fully clothed, and it really is emblematic about the action, it's the intent, it's the provocation, and anything unwanted, anything that is unlawful, unwanted word, action, violating someone's body, violating someone's, privacy and all these lists of what sexual harassment mean before it actually becomes physical is what people don't even understand. Like what you said, when you take it to the court of law and you're talking about even not being physical yet, even that people don't have a clear understanding.
It starts at such a young age where men think they have
male
access
entitlement.
to you, entitlement. You should always, just as you say sometimes, you should just smile and everything is okay. And that's where it starts. This idea that women belong to everyone and the catcalling. We learn to fall in line. Oh, don't walk this way, don't walk that way, because there'd be men hitting on you here and then. We learn to avoid all these pitfalls.
Avoid the predators. There's always a trigger, actually. There's a harass map, it's called, this app that really tracks this kind of behavior, like, oogling on someone, or even these things that you don't think that you're harassing someone, be it catcalling or making facial expressions that are unwanted. I mean, that's the bottom line. When something is unwanted, it reaches the level.
But Heidi, you talked about the workplace, and I was stunned earlier this year when I found out that the African Union didn't have a sexual harassment provision in their language. This is the African Union. I mean, if they don't have it, then what's to say about other?
They're not setting the standard. What can you expect at a very grassroots community level?
I think in the legal system we should definitely define those words, make them precise. It's also interesting the UN quotes the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's definition of sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal, physical conduct of a sexual nature.
Here we go again about unwanted and having that in the letter of the law with different factors under this.
There are definitely different bullet points, but this is mainly what it is.
Well, ladies, I would say we go to our dictionaries and we go and figure out what the actual definition of sexual harassment is, and we share this kind of knowledge so that we can arm ourselves and arm women, because you're going to need it at some point. Well, coming up, we highlight women across the continent who are working to expand justice to all citizens. But first, you just heard about the creation of the term for sexual harassment in Amharic. Well, that's made us curious about other languages. We asked our VOA Africa colleagues how they refer to sexual harassment in their native language. Take a listen.
In my language, which is Hausa, we don't have a word for sexual harassment. The closest thing that we have is piati, which directly translates as rape in English. Even rape is not something that's acknowledged. It's not something that you talk about unless it's something that was done with witnesses. Sexual harassment isn't really a concept that exists in our culture. Being touched inappropriately is not considered sexual harassment.
The word sexual harassment in Somali language, it's called sexual harassment, a kind of gabadfalka galmada, which means woman is being either raped or sexually harassed. But due to the Somali cultural norms, people do not openly talk about sexual harassed women and rape cases. But contrary to that, for the past few years, including this year, 2019, we have witnessed and reported a lot of cases of rape, young girls as young as like 9 years old, 10 years old, who are being sexually harassed, raped, and finally killed. So, but talking about the word sexual harassment in the society of the Somali people, it's kind of taboo. We don't openly talk.
In Swahili, we say unyanyasaji wa ngono or unyanyasaji wa kijinsia. Unyanyasaji wa kijinsia, it's both genders. Jinsia is gender, so it's sexual harassment. It's direct ngono. Ngono is sexual. So yes, we do have sexual harassment in unyanyasaji wa ngono.
Is it common for people to use that?
Yes, nowadays it's very common. People are using it.
There is a word for sexual harassment in my language, which is Shona. It's called kumbunyi kizwa, which technically means invading someone's personal space, but it can also apply to sexual harassment for both women and men.
Welcome back to Our Voices. Today in our segment called Women to Watch, we are highlighting women who are working to change laws in their countries and expanding justice.
Here's a woman to watch, Fatoumata Sori, a remarkable lawyer originally from Sierra Leone. Sori leads a group of female lawyers who offer pro bono work to prosecute rapists to the full extent of the law. They also conduct outreach to families, encouraging people to break their silence about sexual violence. Rape and sexual violence has been declared to be a national emergency. The country had more than 8,500 reported cases last year, but thousands more went unreported. Sori believes her group is not only punishing criminals, but encouraging more victims to speak out and changing the culture that makes violence against women acceptable. I spoke to her recently and she said, we need to keep the fight going and to curb this menace within our society.
My woman to watch is Athalia Molokome. She was the first female Attorney General of Botswana, and she also served as a justice on the High Court. Molokome is a gender activist and former professor at the University of Botswana. She spent more than 3 decades working on gender issues at the national, regional, and international level. She has published books and papers on family law, customary law, and employment law, including her thesis covering protection of extramarital children under law in Botswana. Today, she serves as the ambassador of Botswana to the United Nations in Geneva. She sounds like an excellent woman.
Who do you think deserves a shout out in the fight for justice? Use the hashtag VOA Our Voices and tell us who you think is a woman to watch. Go to voanews.com where you can also find previous episode of Our Voices.
And today the last word goes to the late Corazon Aquino, the first female president of the Philippines, who used her voice to say, reconciliation should be accompanied by justice, otherwise it will not last. While we all hope for peace, it shouldn't be peace at any cost, but peace based on principle, on justice.
Well, that's our last word for today. A special thank you to VOA multimedia journalist Salim Solomon. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here with you today.
To have you.
Thanks for having me.
On behalf of the Voice of America and along with my colleagues, thanks for tuning into Our Voices. Good day.